So thank you so much for such a warm, warm welcome, and for all of you for being here today. So I got started doing this work it was about 23 years ago, 23 years, 2 days, and 15 minutes, when Dr. Holly Prigerson knocked on my door at the University of Pittsburgh and said that she had identified a syndrome of grief and it wasn't responding to treatments for depression, and I was doing anxiety disorder research, so she thought maybe I could help. And those were the days when I basically said yes to almost anything anybody asked me, and that's how I started this work. So today, 23 years later, I will say that it's really become the center of my life, because working with people in this way has been so tremendously gratifying, really. And so I think that's one thing that most people who work with bereaved people learn after a while. It's not obvious in the beginning. It seems very frightening, and it seems, as John Bowlby says, like nothing can help people who've lost people who they love very, very much. But actually that turns out not to be true. And I think personally it's a testament to the resilience of human beings. And it's being able to observe that over and over that I think gives this whole kind of work its wonder, basically. So what I want to do today is talk to you about how we have gone about recognizing and treating people with complicated grief. So first we're going to talk about what is complicated grief, at least from my perspective. And you know, that I have only one of many, many perspectives, but hopefully I can help you think about it at least a little bit more clearly. So we'll start by talking about grief and adaptation to loss, and complicated grief as persistent impairing grief, and then how to diagnose complicated grief using ICD-11 criteria, or actually it's really, as you know, a guideline. And then I want to tell you about complicated grief treatment, and I'm going to show you a fair amount about the evidence base for this, the results of some of the 3 studies that we've conducted, and then describe it to you in kind of a big picture way. And then tomorrow, for those of you who are interested, or maybe people who aren't here, I'm not sure, but I will be doing a one-day workshop to try to get into the weeds, as we say, of how you do that treatment. So let's start by defining grief. That seems like it should be a simple thing to do, but one of the things that plagues this field is a lot of different ways of using language, and I guess that's just natural. But we define grief as the response to loss. I think that's generally how it's defined in the world of thanatology, death studies. But some people do define it as an emotion. Grief is an emotion. We don't think it's a single emotion, and we don't really think it's one thing. What we do think, the way we understand grief, is that it is literally the form love takes when someone we love dies. And if someone dies, of course, their death is permanent, as far as we know. And so grief, we're going to respond in some way to that permanent loss forever, essentially. So grief, like love, is permanent when someone dies, or grief like death, I should say. But that doesn't mean it's simple. We know that grief is very complex. We respond to the loss of a loved one with pretty much our entire body, our mind, our brain. We respond fully. We respond spiritually. We respond socially to a loss like this. And the response that any one of us has is different than anyone else. So the response is variable in that way. It's also different depending on who it is we lost. So if you've lost more than one person in your life, you know that you didn't grieve in exactly the same way for the two people or the many people that you may have lost. And of course, other people grieving the same loss experience that loss differently. Their response is going to be different. And what's said in the grief therapy world, a sort of mantra, is everyone grieves in their own way. And that is, of course, true. And not only do we grieve differently, each of us, but any of us, as we go through time, our response to the loss changes. And in the beginning, it changes kind of erratically. In other words, it's different maybe from day to day, sometimes even hour to hour. But it also tends to evolve over time. So grief tends to move from being very acute and dominating in a person's life right after someone dies to gradually becoming integrated and moving into the background. We sometimes say that the person we love moves from dominating our minds to resting peacefully in our hearts. So in spite of all of this variability and changes and complexity, there are still some commonalities, and that's of course how we can work with people, because we can kind of discern and conceptualize the commonalities. So what are these? Well, first of all, most of us respond to an important loss with a pretty intense reaction that we call acute grief. And it's characterized by strong emotions, sort of insistent, I like to say insistent, preoccupying thoughts, a lot of behaviors that we do that are centered around the loss, and responses from other people as well. So the emotions, the core emotions of grief, and this was pointed out many years ago by Colin Murray Parks, include yearning and longing. And actually, we add sorrow, because I haven't met too many grieving people who aren't sad. Sadness isn't as specific to grief as yearning and longing is, but it's virtually always present. But so are almost every other kind of painful emotion you can imagine. And again, those insistent thoughts and memories of the person who died. And then a desire, a lot of behaviors that people do to try to kind of continue to feel close to the person. These often involve sensory stimulation, smelling the clothes, listening to the voice of the person, looking at pictures of the person who died, sometimes touching even. People will touch themselves and try to feel what it felt like when the person was there. And then also avoiding reminders that they're gone. Again, grief changes as we adapt to the loss, and basically finds a place in our lives. And usually that place is kind of in the background, and it's something, so the person remains with us. We basically map the people that we love in our brains. This is something John Bowlby taught us many decades ago, although maybe not that long ago, but depends on your perspective. But that the people we love are mapped in memories in our minds, in all kinds of memory systems in our brains. So they stay with us. But how they stay with us is very variable. And again, it's variable between people, it's variable for different people, for the same, different people who we've lost. But we don't forget the people that we're grieving. We don't forget them. It's really pretty much impossible to forget them. And if we move forward and adapt to the loss and move forward in our own lives in a way that's intrinsically motivated, those people will emerge in our lives from time to time in ways that we need them and want them. And then they'll kind of recede into the background when we're doing other things. So what we need is a renewed sense of purpose and meaning in our lives and renewed connections to other people. And both of those are usually kind of disrupted, at least, during acute grief. So that's part of what adapting is going to mean. So we think of adapting, again following Bowlby, as meaning that we have to find a way to accept the reality of the death, and that means, I don't know the word accept in English. I once looked this up because I struggle over words a lot. I try to get straight about definitions. In English, accept has something like 13 different definitions. And a lot of them mean welcome, you know, someone's welcomed. And that's not what we mean. We don't welcome this reality. But we do need to understand, to comprehend it and accept it in the sense that we don't fight it, the finality and the consequences or the meaning of this loss in our own lives. That's what accept the reality means to us. And also the changed relationship, of course, with the person who died. So again, we still have that relationship. I mean, this is what I usually do. How many people in this room are sitting next to the person they love the most in their lives? That's what I thought. Either you didn't understand what I said, or the person you love most is not here. I'm gonna assume it's the latter. And think about that. Are you worried about them? Are they preoccupying your mind? Are you thinking that you won't find them again? No, none of that. Why not? Because they're in your memory system. They're in your brain. We call it a working model. Psychologists in the room call this a working model. And the working model means that we have natural understanding of the person and expectations and predictions that are realistic about them. So we don't have to worry about it. We don't, as long as our expectations and predictions are realistic, it's okay. But when they die, of course, those expectations that we have right now are no longer realistic. So what we have to do is we have to revise that working model so that we understand, again, the finality and the consequences, especially the finality in this case, so that our brains can kind of regroup in a sense. And then we can connect with those people that we have lost in a different way, of course, but still connect with them. So that's one big thing we have to do to adapt. And the other thing to do is that we have to be able to envision the future in a positive way, as having possibilities for joy and satisfaction, which again often seem lost forever right after someone dies. And with someone with complicated grief, that feeling persists. So because we were trying to build a treatment, we built first a model that bereavement naturally triggers acute grief. The loss triggers a response, in other words, and the response is usually acute grief. And also, based on a lot of recent work, we now know that there is not only a Freudian unconscious, we all probably do have some version of a Freudian unconscious, which is an unconscious with id, ego, and superego, and a lot of conflict and that sort of thing going on, but we also have an adaptive unconscious. And the adaptive unconscious actually tries to help us. Instead of trying to undermine us, it tries to help us and guides us towards living a fulfilling life. And so we think that the human race would not have survived if, because we all lose people we love, right? And that's happened forever. It's part of life. If we didn't have a pretty good way of adapting without even trying that hard. And we think that happens. And that's one of the things that I think is very, very important in working with bereaved people, is that you have to understand that they have their own natural adaptive process that includes these, basically orients them towards achieving adaptation. And as that happens, acute grief is integrated. So it's a pretty simple model. And we think this is universal, basically. So if this is universal, what is complicated grief? And of course, there is a lot of confusion about this. So I'm going to, as I said before, try to do a little bit to straighten that out. So first of all, again, we're going to get into definitions of words, because the word complicated in English, and again, I don't know about Danish, but in English, there is an everyday life kind of definition, which means that something is kind of intricate and difficult to kind of tease apart, difficult to understand or analyze. And in that sense, almost all grief is complicated. It has a lot of parts, it's complex, it's changing, so it's multifaceted and time varying, so that's kind of complicated. But in medicine, in English, complicated refers to a process in which there's some kind of superimposed problem that prolongs the healing process. If someone has an injury or an illness that needs to heal, we talk about a complication as impeding that process. And by that way of looking at things, less than 10% probably of grief is complicated, somewhere between 7 and 10, 12%, I would say. We don't really know because we haven't yet defined this condition. But we use the medical definition. So we think of complications as being psychological and social processes that interfere with adaptation. And we think of it, again, sort of analogous to a wound that is complicated by an infection or inadequate blood supply or something like that, and it interferes with healing. But there's yet another definition of complicated in the field, and it's an important one, and this one I think Maya O'Connor will talk about later. It's been promoted by a very illustrious group of colleagues listed on this slide in a paper written, first authored by Teresa Rando, but also having Ken Doka and Colin Murray Parks and the other authors from around the world really as co-authors. And it was published in the journal Omega. They called it A Call to the Field, Complicated Grief in the DSM-5. So I just want to say a little bit about this. They said that there's not just a single form of complicated grief, but rather many forms of it. And they said, we urge that in future, that in future editions of, future research strives to identify all of these different forms, and that eventually there will be diagnostic categories for all of them. So this would actually, if we did this would, and if this were true, which I'm not saying it's not because I don't know, but I sort of think that, and I'll tell you more about this as we go along, I sort of think that the persistent impairing form of grief is what we really need to focus on and what we really know exists. And we don't see a lot of these other forms of what they're referring to as complicated grief. And not only that, it's almost like we would need a whole new diagnostic system just for bereavement-related conditions. And I would say that we have enough controversy, and there is a huge controversy in the United States. It's diminishing some, and I think maybe here in Europe too, but a lot of controversy over whether we're pathologizing a normal human response even by having one definition of, by having one condition, which it pretty clearly there are more than 3,000 papers in English about this in the professional literature about this condition. Lots of research now has been done, and it all points to the same thing, which is that people who suffer in this way have a lot of negative health consequences, and their lives are pretty much brought to a standstill. When I go to a cocktail party, I used to go to cocktail parties with I don't do that anymore, but with colleagues from my anxiety disorder days, and I can't tell you how many times people would say, "What are you doing now?" and "Tell me about this, I don't understand it," and I would explain it, and they would say, "Oh my gosh, that was my grandmother," or "Oh my gosh, that my mother, after lost a child and she was like this all of her life." I mean, people really recognize it in others. So I'm just wanting to say that I think we need to be straight about what we're talking about, and I think that we need to change the name. We in New York need to change the name complicated grief, because there are people who are thoughtful and smart who are saying this kind of complication. But I do hope we don't go too far along that road before we finish the work for this one. So luckily, ICD-11 and DSM-5 have both weighed in, as you may know, and both of them entertained proposals for a new diagnosis, and both concluded that there was substantial evidence to support it. And this was back in 2013, and that evidence base has just grown since then. In the 5 years since 2013, we have even more. I think there's now another 1,000 articles. We just summarized this recently, but I don't remember the exact number. They both grappled with what to call this, because there were two proposals. One was presented by Holly Prigerson as prolonged grief disorder, and the other was presented by our group as complicated grief. And they both rejected, after some lengthy discussion, I think, the label complicated grief. ICD named the condition prolonged grief disorder, as you probably know, and developed a simple, clinically very meaningful guideline. I personally think it's pretty wonderful. DSM, on the other hand, named the condition persistent complex bereavement disorder and developed a complex, lengthy algorithm. So where does that leave us? Well, still with a lot of confusion about diagnosis. And there is now, as I said, recognition of the syndrome of persistent impairing grief, but there are at least still 3 different names, and that's partly our fault, and I apologize for that. But I think we need to settle on probably prolonged grief or persistent grief, something like that. And then there's also confusion, unfortunately promulgated by some of our colleagues, about whether these terms refer to the same or different individuals, because there have been several publications now that try to make the argument that complicated grief is very different from prolonged grief disorder. And that's actually not true. That is completely not true. And I'm going to show you the evidence for that in a minute. So that's kind of unfortunate. Okay, so the current status is that again, I'm sure you know, that PGD is included in ICD-11, which was released in June to the public, as I understand it. And it's slated, even though it hasn't been, its final round of approval, I think, hasn't occurred, and that's expected, as I understand it, in May of 2019. DSM placed PCBD in Section 3 of the DSM-5, which was intended to be a call for more research on the criteria. They weren't saying this doesn't have enough backing it. They were saying, we don't know we take these 2 proposals, they're kind of different, and we cannot resolve the dispute. That's what they have told us verbally, and that's what they were telling us by doing this. So we took that to heart when we heard it, our group, and we've now conducted tests of the different criteria sets in 2 independent samples, independent from the ones in which we were sometimes said to have not used empirical methods in developing the criteria that we developed. That's also not true. We didn't use the same methods as the Prigerson group, who are very, very sophisticated and smart and have done a very thoughtful job of developing those criteria. But we did it also a thoughtful job of it, just different from them. I won't say that we're better or worse. I don't know. I don't think either is. I think we need to bring them together, but that has not yet been possible. So, we then went about testing in a totally different clinical sample, and also a community survey that a colleague, Stephen Koza, who is a retired military colonel in the U.S., had decided to do the first ever, actually, bereaved military family survey back, again, starting around 2013. And he asked, actually, both Holly Prigerson and myself to be consultants on that study, and we were, and he decided to use the instrument that we had developed to collect data with, and he's subsequently done several interesting analyses of that data, which I'm going to show you in a minute. PGD criteria, in addition to our studies, which include PGD criteria, but in addition to that, they've been used in many interesting studies since 2013. And I'm not reviewing that literature today, but it's really very interesting and helpful. However, to our knowledge, we have not been able to find actually a test of the criteria other than a reanalysis of the original data set from which those criteria were derived, which was a group of widows. It was all older adult widows in Connecticut. That was their sample. And it is, I think, truly a bit representative. It's somewhat representative of the larger group, and there are reasons why that is probably true. But it really is questionable how generalizable that is. So that's where we stand right now. So I'm going to tell you about our work, because that's what I know. And these are the publications about the diagnostic criteria from our group. And here are the colleagues who have worked with us, which includes Stephen Koza, who I just mentioned, also our group that has done clinical trials together, and Dr. Philip Lavori, who's a senior biostatistician at Stanford, Dr. Robert Ursano, who is a senior researcher in trauma and heads the trauma center at the Uniformed Services University in the United States. And then, as I said, so Barry Lebowitz, Charles Reynolds, Naomi Simon, and Sidney Zizuk were all co-investigators, really co-principal investigators in our most recent treatment study. And as you probably know, Sidney Zizuk in particular is one of the pioneers in grief research. He developed the Texas Inventory of Grief and then the Texas Revised Inventory of Grief back in 1979, and did the San Diego Widow Study, which was a landmark community survey. And Dr. Charles Reynolds is primarily a depression researcher for older adults, but he has done a lot of work with bereavement for many, many years as well. So first I want to show you summarize the results of the performance of PCBD criteria as well as PGD and CG criteria in the community sample of bereaved military family members. There were 17,000. I think actually this is now a little bit higher than that. Spouses, partners, parents, siblings, and adult children of service members who were on active duty at the time of their death, not necessarily in combat, but on active duty. And they died primarily. So these are primarily young people who died, of course, service members, and primarily, almost exclusively, by some kind of violent method, combat, accident, suicide, or homicide. So we started with a definition of clinical cases, and this is something that is very, I think, important and is a little bit problematic in the Prigerson PG-13 data, because they don't have they don't have a clinical case definition. And this is something that plagues this field. It's not easy to do, and we did it, but I'm not saying that we did it right either. We did the best we could with it, but we were very clear about trying to decide who is it we're trying to identify here with diagnostic criteria, because otherwise it gets very circular. So the clinical cases that we think almost certainly have whatever this condition is, have scores on the Inventory of Complicated Grief, which is really the instrument that Holly Prigerson developed in 1995 and tested. And it's 19 items, a self-report questionnaire. It's pretty simple. And it was one of the reasons why I was able to do the early studies, why I even decided to try, because you have to have a valid, reliable measure that you can use to identify people and as an outcome measure if you're going to do these studies. So, so that's what and in Holly's work, she claimed that the score over 25, well, she identified it as a score over 25, the top 20% of these were also older adult spousally bereaved individuals. And the top 20% scored 25 or over on the Inventory of Complicated Grief. And there have been now really dozens of studies using that CUT score, and every single one of them shows negative health outcomes, significantly more negative health outcomes using that CUT score. That's sort of the best we do. When we started our pilot work, we found that people who were scoring between 25 and 30 seemed, I don't know, we weren't, just clinically, they didn't feel like they absolutely needed treatment. So we decided we wanted to be conservative, and we used a CUT score. This is not scientific, this was a clinical decision. We used a CUT score of 30, but that seems to have worked well subsequently. So in this study also, people who scored over 30 on the Inventory of Complicated Grief, and then another measure, which is called, it's a 5-item self-report scale called the Work and Social Adjustment Scale that we've used a lot in our work, and it came from, it is an instrument developed by Dr. Isaac Marks, who was a very famous behavior, I guess, he's still alive as far as I know, but he's not very active these days. He's English, and he was very active in developing behavior therapy for anxiety disorders. And a score over 20 has been, on that scale, has been documented to show moderately severe impairment in functioning in mood, anxiety, and eating disorders. So using those two together, 260 of those individuals that I just mentioned who are in this study, which is 15% of the overall sample, are identified as the target group that we're trying to identify with the diagnostic criteria. And our biostatisticians, Dr. Philip Lavori and Dr. Helena Kramer, also consulted with us, and she was the consultant for the DSM-5, and she told us, don't try to do sensitivity, specificity analyses with this sample, because A, it's not a random sample of the community. It is not a random sample. Random samples are extremely difficult to obtain, and actually Holly's work in the Connecticut Widows comes close to being that. It's still not exact, but it's limited because it's Connecticut Widows, but it's actually wonderful because it was pretty much a random sample. Steve's study was more just trying to get people to, as many people as he could, to sign up. And they said you should do conditional probability analyses of this, and you should identify people who definitely do not, or almost certainly, we don't know anything definite here, but almost certainly don't have the syndrome, and people who almost certainly do. And that intermediate group who score between 20 and 30 on the Inventory of Complicated Grief, we really don't know, actually, what they should be. So they said leave them out for this analysis, and that's what we did. So this slide has a lot of data. I usually don't show these kinds of slides, but I was a little pressed for time, so I did this. So, but anyway, you can get some sense if you look at this of the community sample overall, which is on your left, I think, yeah, and on your left, and the clinical and then the non-clinical sample with respect to gender, race, ethnicity, and relationship to the deceased and the cause of death. So it's basically, as I said, it's still primarily white. Almost all of our data is primarily Caucasian. And so it's not quite representative of our population in the US, at least. And also you can see that the overall scores are kind of high on the inventory of complicated grief. And even on this work and social adjustment scale, 10 is still definite indicator of impairment, but more mild. And the PHQ we have here too. So what is the conditional probability of correctly identifying the clinical cases and excluding the non-clinical cases? Well, first of all, so both PCBD and PGD criteria, and these are the PLOS PGD criteria or the Prigerson PGD criteria, not the ICD-11 criteria or guideline, which I'm going to show you in a minute. They're very different. They're not very different, but they are definitely different. And our proposed CG criteria. So they excluded 100%, and the CG criteria excluded 98% of those that we thought almost certainly didn't have complicated grief. And then the CG criteria identified 92% of those that we thought should have a clinical diagnosis, whereas the PCBD criteria identified only 53% of those, and the PGD criteria only 59%. So Steve then did a sort of, he did a test of how important the WSAS, or the functional impairment, was, and this shows you that across different levels from 10 to, what is that one? Greater than 24. So we use this is what we've used as our criteria, but we went up from there. And what you can see is that the line is almost straight for CG, but for PCBD and PGD, more functional impairment does capture more. So if you assume that no one has the disorder or no one is a clinical case unless they have a huge amount of functional impairment, then you get closer to 65% endorsement of the PGD and PCBD criteria. That's still leaving out more than a third of the people who we think actually meet those criteria or should be considered a clinical case. So we were heavily criticized by the Prigerson group for not including that middle sample. So we thought, okay, we should try that, see what happens. Maybe they're right. So, so we did Steve has done additional analyses. He's preparing this paper for publication because, just so you know why this is taking so long, which it is, it's because Steve and I are also doing a study where we tried to develop a mobile app to help people in his bereaved military family. We have a grant to do this, and we're testing that app against an app that just has information about wellness. And that study has taken over both of our lives. So that's what happens when you get research studies, when you try to do research. But in any case, he has done these analyses. So going back to this, so when he includes the entire military family bereavement data set now, so not leaving out that middle group between 20 and 30, using the same criteria for clinical caseness, namely the inventory of complicated grief more than 20 and the inventory and the more than 30 and the work and social adjustment scale more than 20, both. When you require both of those, still PGD PLOS and PCBD criteria identify only 50% of the cases, in this overall data set and accurately exclude 96. Now this reanalysis has also included ICD-11 PGD, and those criteria, or that guideline, like the CG criteria, correctly identify in this analysis 80% and accurately exclude more than 85%. So looking at this visually, this whole, can you see that? I don't know if you can see that. Okay, let's see, I think we can do it this way. So this whole area, the square, is all of the people in the study. And this outside circle is all the people identified using the ICD-11 guideline. And the next, this just slightly inside that is the CG criteria. And then these two inner circles are the PGD and PCBD criteria. But what's important here is that we're obviously talking about the same people. It's the same group, and it's a question of how far out from that circle you're going to go. And that is an open question. We, of course, have our opinion about it, but these are judgment calls. We don't really, I mean, you can look at the ICG, there's debate about that, I guess, I don't know. But it is a judgment call. But we're all talking about these. These are not a different group than we're including in the CG. That's what's really important. And this group goes a little bit farther out in terms of the symptoms and impairment. So also important, if we then looked at both PGD plus and DSM-5 criteria, we compared those who met and did not meet, those who were not identified. So these are the people who are missing. And their mean score on the Inventory of Complicated Grief is 41. And I can tell you, having done this work for so long, that people who score in our clinic, people who score 41 on this instrument definitely are struggling with complicated grief. Without any impairment assessment needed, if I see someone who no one tells me what their ICG score is and I do a clinical interview and it turns out their score was 40, they always have what I consider clinically to be complicated grief. And similarly, the scores were very high. I told you 20, an impairment level of 20 in any mood or anxiety disorder is considered moderate or moderately high levels of functional impairment. So people not in that inner circle, that next circle out, so who we're talking about here, who have these very high scores, are these people right here, who are in this outer circle, who are not being identified. So that's part of the evidence. So then we also looked, as I said, at the clinical sample. This is the clinical sample. Christine Mauro, who is a biostatistician in our group, published this paper in 2017. And we included a non-clinical group of bereaved individuals, which we got from Chip Reynolds Late Life Depression Prevention and Treatment Center in Pittsburgh, or Naomi Simon's Center for Anxiety and Traumatic Stress at Mass General Hospital. And these were all people who actually had had a major bereavement, but who were help-seeking. We thought it would be important to use that criteria as well, but not necessarily for grief, but they were seeking help for psychological problems. And they all scored under 20 on the ICG. Okay, so again, our definition of clinical caseness is very similar to the COSA study, but we were seeing these people in person. So they did all have a score 30 or higher on the 19-item Inventory of Complicated Grief. And in this case, they were judged by an experienced clinician to have complicated grief as the condition most in need of treatment. And they had a positive response to the question, which is on the clinical interview for complicated grief. Overall, is grief interfering a lot with your ability to work or socialize or function in other ways? They had to say yes to that. So we found almost the exact same thing that Steve found, namely that, well, ICD-11 now wasn't exactly in his, it was in that circle thing, but anyway, ICD-11 identifies virtually the same group as CG, and PCBD and PGD identify also some of the same people, but miss 30 to 50% of those that we are identifying by either of these other means. So just to tell you a little bit more about this, so then we decided, you know, when PGD, when we knew that PGD was the final decision by ICD-11, we became, and also when these papers were published trying to say that there were two papers in the British literature that were trying to make claims about ICD-11 which we felt were inconsistent with what we were reading in ICD-11. So that's why we did this. We compared PGD plus to the ICD-11 guideline. And the first thing we did was we had to operationalize the ICD-11, and I have to apologize to anyone who uses ICD-11 because you're not supposed to operationalize it. But the only way you can study it is to operationalize it, and this is how we did it. This is our instrument over here, and you can see that it matches pretty well. So we were able to match the items that are included in that guideline pretty much exactly using our instrument. And then we decided to see, you know, how well different levels, so ICD-11 doesn't tell you how many of these criteria you should use. They actually just say some evidence of the associated criteria. We'll talk about it in a minute. If you don't know the specifics of this, I will explain it to you. But if you use 0, 1, or 2 additional criteria in our data, at least in the clinical data set, it makes virtually no difference, so you can pick whatever you want. But, and I'll say more about what I think that implication is later. Then in this area, we're starting to lose that sensitivity, but maybe it's acceptable. But below, if you require more than 4, you start to get really low on your, and 6 especially, if you require 6 of those criteria, you're really only identifying less than half of the clinical sample. Okay, so, and then we mapped the PGD plus criteria, which we'd already done, and they map well onto these symptoms also. So, and then we looked at the rates of diagnosis of clinical cases using either the operationalized ICD-11 guideline, and I believe that we used one additional, I think that the way we did these analyses was to use one additional associated symptom from that list that I just showed you. And we found again, what we keep finding, 96% identified by ICD-11, 59% by the other PGD criteria, and that is a significant difference. And neither incorrectly diagnosed the bereaved clinical sample that I showed you before. It's not a very stringent test, but it's a little bit of a test of specificity. It's not a formal test of specificity, but it gives you some information. So we were kind of interested, would demographic, clinical, or loss-related variables tell us anything about who was being diagnosed and not being diagnosed by the PLOS criteria? And interestingly, and I'll tell you why it's interesting in a minute, what we found was that widows and those with a concurrent diagnosis of depression, major depression, were more likely to be diagnosed, significantly more likely to be diagnosed by PGD plus criteria than so widows more likely than other participants, especially married ones, who had a really low rate of, if you were married in our clinical data set, then the PGD criteria why this is, I don't know, but then the PGD criteria had only a 38% likelihood of diagnosing you, rate of diagnosing you, I should say. And if you had a concurrent diagnosis of depression, you were diagnosed, you had a 64% likelihood of diagnosis with PGD compared to 45% if you weren't depressed. If the person was bereaved of a partner compared to a child or someone else, especially, and also a parent, but less so, but it's very dramatically different between a bereaved partner, a child, or someone else. And if they were bereaved by a non-violent death, then the PGD plus criteria were more likely to diagnose them. And that's interesting. What's interesting about all this, I don't know why it is, honestly, but what's interesting is that maps on to the sample that the criteria were developed from. In other words, they were widows. They were widows, in a demographic where depression is more likely. They were so they were widows, so they were bereaved of a partner, and almost all were nonviolent. So, and it's also interesting because loss of a child and loss of someone by violent means is well known and well documented. Both of those situations are associated with the highest ICG scores that people endorse. So the symptoms that you see following the loss of people that are not included here are well known to be likely to be higher, actually, even than the ones included. So I honestly don't understand exactly why this is, but I think it is interesting, as I said. Then we said, okay, maybe there's a treatment difference because in general, even though I showed you that the people who are not diagnosed still have a high rate of symptomatology, a high level of symptomatology and impairment, the ones that are diagnosed, which I didn't show you, are significantly higher than that. So that inner group is the highest severity group. So there is that severity difference. And so we thought, okay, there's a severity difference. Maybe the people that are not diagnosed really don't need our treatment, or maybe they won't even respond that well to it. But what we found, actually, in this analysis was there was absolutely no difference. There was no difference in treatment adherence, and no difference to really one of our other interventions in this data set was to compare citalopram or an antidepressant medication to placebo, and there was no difference in the response rates to that either. So we conclude that the ICD-11 is the way to go. I mean, it seems, and I've actually thought this since 2015. I published a paper in 2015 in the New England Journal of Medicine summarizing where we stood with identifying, where I thought we stood with identifying complicated grief and treating it. And this is what I said then, because I thought the ICD, I think the ICD is so much better than the DSM. You are recording this, aren't you? That's not good. But I do think it's a very good document, and it's really an excellent way in particular of diagnosing prolonged grief disorder. So what is it? In case you don't know, they basically say that you have to observe persistent and pervasive longing or preoccupation with the deceased that causes significant impairment in important areas of functioning. That's the core of the diagnosis. In addition, they say that there should be, they don't say at least one, they just say there's additional indication of intense emotional pain, and they give these e.g. or such as examples of sadness, guilt, anger, denial, blame, difficulty accepting the death. But I've had conversations with Andreas Merker, who chaired this work group, and others who were on it, and what they've said is these are intended as examples. They aren't intended as criterion symptoms, the way that we have criterion symptoms in DSM. But gives you the idea. And that it has to persist at least 6 months, and that it has to clearly exceed the social norms, basically, in the individual's culture and context. And that's pretty much everyone agrees to that. One comment about the 6 months, we don't have good data about what time frame we should use here, and it's a very important question, I guess, for making a diagnosis. It's certainly required. PGD does say 6 months. DSM said 1 year, and we initially supported the 6 months because the teeny little bit of data there is does sort of push you towards 6 months. However, we ended up thinking that it was better. We've ended up thinking that we need to kind of try to come together. And if you think that, you know, if half the world, let's say, or even a third of the world, or whatever number of people think that it should be at least 12 months, that should satisfy the people who think it's at least 6 months, because 12 months is, I mean, if it's at least 6 months, then it's also at least 12 months, whereas the reverse is not true. So it seems like it makes more sense to say that this should be after 12 months at this point. But apparently they're not going to change that in ICD, and I don't know if it's all that important. One other comment about the time frame is that again, the Connecticut Widow Study, the Yale Bereavement Study, was conducted in bereaved widows, as I said, and data was analyzed only for symptoms up to 6 months, and then the 12-month period was the follow-up. And they didn't collect any data at all after 1 year. So the criteria that are developed were developed, I think we could maybe make the assumption that those criteria, maybe they're needed earlier on, because maybe the more stringent criteria, because we know there's a lot more kind of activation in the first period after the death, and maybe that lasts on average for up to 6 months or more. And so if you have that whole arena of a lot of activation, how do you discern the ones that are really going to be, that really aren't adapting? Because it takes a long time to adapt to a loss. It doesn't happen overnight. So it may be that that's why those criteria are so stringent. Just a thought. Let's go back to the way we understand this condition, because I want to now tell you about our treatment. So again, we're seeing complicated grief as analogous to a wound complication. So this is where, I told you this before, but we're making the assumption that this is universal and that the people we're seeing have this in place, have brought, big picture, 30,000 feet perspective. They're bereaved, they have acute grief, they have they automatically have these kinds of, this is naturally triggered, all of this. However, they also are experiencing grief complications, which actually, all of these maladaptive thoughts, dysfunctional behaviors, problems regulating emotions, and not so much severe social environmental problems, but those psychological problems, those are complications. Those are also almost universal certainly after a difficult loss, whatever made that loss difficult for you. If you had a difficult loss, but actually even if you had any loss, the likelihood that you have some kind of second guessing going on, if only I had done something or other, maybe this person wouldn't have died. Diagnose them, they'd been diagnosed earlier, they hadn't gone out that night, whatever. Almost everyone has those thoughts, but they usually don't get a foothold. When they get a foothold, they start to become center stage, and that's what's going on instead of adapting. And the same thing with the excessive avoidance. Everybody avoids some, and it's probably a good idea to have some avoidance as you're trying to adapt to a loss. But it's when it gets a foothold, and when it's the only way the person can think of regulating those very intense, painful emotions, that things become problematic. So this is how we understand what happens. And so this is what happens to the model, is that we have not only the response that I've been showing you, but also these impediments occur. And they either stall or fully block adaptation. And when that happens, we don't grief is not integrated. And if grief isn't integrated and it's permanent, what happens to it? It stays as acute. It stays acute, and it's it's kind of accompanied by a fairly prominent appearance of these kind of second guessing or grief judging or catastrophizing about the future kinds of thinking, and a lot of avoidance behaviors, which are often, by the way, not recognized by the person or the clinician. If you're not, that's one thing I brought into this work was a very heightened sensitivity to how to evaluate avoidance, because that's what happens in anxiety disorders. It's not easy, and we knew that in anxiety disorders because people avoid avoidance, right? You say, are you avoiding? You say to an agoraphobic, are you avoiding anything? And they say, no. And you say, they say, I'm not avoiding anything. And you say, well, do you ever go to the supermarket? And they say, the supermarket? Never. I would never set foot in the supermarket. So you have to ask very specific questions. Okay. So there's an estimated, thanks to our colleague in the audience, colleagues, I should say, but not yet Dr. Lundorf. We know that about 7% of naturally bereaved people like the Connecticut widows, about 7% of them develop complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder, I guess we should say. And the rate is higher, maybe about 15%, is what Steve's group seems to say, among those bereaved by violent death. And by the way, there are many other studies of prolonged grief or complicated grief following violent death, and they all show a very elevated, definitely elevated prevalence compared to natural deaths. So we think of grief as the story of love after loss. This is another way of saying it. And a grief story usually unfolds and it evolves as we adapt, but sometimes the storyline gets lost and acute grief persists and intensifies. And I want to show you some examples of this.
My involvement in the treatment was around the death of my mother. However, my husband died about 2 or 3 years later, and I think that really exacerbated the situation. But my mom was almost 85 years old, had really only been ill for less than a month, and she passed away. We were very, very close. I could not imagine living without her. I never really recovered because her death left this gaping hole inside of me. And although my husband was still alive, he wasn't my mom. So I sort of just kind of wandered around through life. I recall looking out my bedroom window and being a little angry because everybody else in the world seemed to just be going on their merry way as though nothing has happened. I'm thinking, how can you do this? Don't you know that the world has lost somebody, wonderful?
My 19-year-old daughter Jackie died in a car wreck on August 21st, the year 2000. She was out that evening and was told to come home at midnight. She got home about 11:45. She was real excited, asked me if she could go out and say goodbye to one more friend, because we were taking her to college on that Tuesday morning. And she left, and I went to bed, and we got a phone call about 3:15 in the morning asking us if our daughter was home. I jumped out of bed and went to her room, and she wasn't there. There wasn't, not a whole lot that I remember about that morning, other than sitting in total disbelief and didn't want to eat, didn't want to do anything, spent most of the day crying. Felt like somebody had torn my heart out. It was my little girl. Well, as time went on, I found that I wasn't progressing or being able to focus myself on work, on anything that I'd like to do. All I could find myself doing is going to work, getting some work done, going in the back room, crying a lot. The more I thought about it, I realized that I wasn't doing anything with my life.
It's been 20 years. My husband died at a relatively young age. He was 53. And I got stuck. I just couldn't move on from that. I just grieved and grieved and grieved. And I thought that somehow that it was my fault that I hadn't been able to diagnose his tumor. So that when he died, there was just this giant hole that just seemed impossible to fill. For years I had horrible nightmares. You know, I'd wake up in the morning and I'd think, no, this did not happen. He's still here. I didn't care whether I lived or died at that point, to be honest, but I had this child. So I would lay on the couch and cry every night, and then I would get up in the morning and I would go to work and do my job, and then I would come home and I would lay on the couch and cry. And I did that for years. That's all I could do. I was paralyzed.
So these are very impactful stories, and these are people who participated in our work, in our treatment in Pittsburgh. And Ginny in particular, I can tell you, it was 20 years since her husband had died and she was still alive, which was in a way a testament to the mental health care that she was getting all of that time. And she was in treatment with someone that we knew, because it was a small community, a very good therapist. But her grief had gone absolutely nowhere, right? And she was convinced that this was how she was going to live the rest of her life. And that turned out not to be true. So I, as usual, didn't manage time very well, but I'm just going to tell you, we only have about 15 more minutes, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about how to identify these people, a little bit more about it. I'm going to skip the research that I was going to show you about the research results of our studies, but I will be doing these salons this afternoon, and I'm happy I can show that data at that time or talk about it. And also, you can read about it. It's all published. So, and then I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we do so you have that sense. So first of all, people self-identify. If you give them the chance, they self-identify. And I think here at the center, you will probably be able to easily give them the chance. But we had a radio ad, and this is literally what it said. And we had a very warm person reading this. And we recruited this was in New York, and we recruited at Columbia University. We do a lot of clinical trials in the Department of Psychiatry, and no one ever recruits their full complement of people. It's one of the headaches of doing clinical trials. It's very difficult to recruit. This happened in Pittsburgh as well. Oops. Anyway, this happened in Pittsburgh as well, and it was because people would tell us they would be listening to the radio and they would hear this come on, and they would pull their car over to the side of the road because they said, oh my gosh, maybe someone actually understands what I've been going through. So people do self-identify. You can also, we developed for a survey that I did with my colleague Susan Essick from she does health services research, a brief grief questionnaire that we used post 9/11, and it's a 5-item scale, and it's easy to use, and it's kind of a screener. And then the inventory of complicated grief, the 19-item scale, is very, very easy to use, and it's an excellent screening tool as well. We have a structured diagnostic interview, or you can do a clinical interview based on what I've told you today if you're a clinician. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to skip now to which I have to do. Oops. Yeah, this is what I want to do. Okay. That's all the results that you're not seeing. And then, think we can start here. So this is our model again. And I think it's pretty obvious, really, what we do. Well, this is our model. It's pretty obvious what we're going to want to do for therapy, right? I mean, if you have this as a model, then you know that you have to first find, well, you have to find and resolve. You don't do one and then the other. We do this kind of simultaneously. But we want to find and resolve those impediments, because if we can do that, then we can free that adaptation to loss process that we think but then often it's been a long time, so we also want to try to facilitate adaptation to loss, which we understand to be helping people accept the reality and also envision a positive life moving forward. And as that happens, grief is integrated and we go away. That's the idea. So the premise of this treatment is that, did I do that again? I'm leaning on something. That loss, of course, triggers acute grief and the adaptive process, and we want to facilitate it. But we also know that that we can't do this, and we don't even want it. So we're focusing on that adaptive process. The suffering is caused by the grief, right? And people come to us wanting help with their grief, and everyone around them wants them to stop grieving so much. But we know that it's hard, but we do not consider grief a problem. And that has to do with what our relationship to suffering is. And this quote, which I guess this is a quote from an article by someone named Pico Iyer, who's an Englishman who lives in Japan, that was in the New York Times in 2013. And actually my teaching assistant in my course at Columbia Social Work School found it and gave it to me to read and said she thought the students should read it, and I said okay, and we gave it to them, and I said to her, after I read it the first time, I said, well, it's a beautiful article, but I don't agree with it. That's what I said. But I kept giving it to them anyway, and I kept reading it, and after about 10 readings, I decided not only do it's not that I don't agree with it, I mean, I do agree with it now because I've learned from it. I've learned so much. So if you don't read anything else after this presentation, read this short. It's a short article in the New York Times. You can find it by Googling it. And he's talking here in this quote about having observed the Dalai Lama go to Ishinomaki, which is a town, one of the fishing towns that was very affected by the tsunami in Japan. And I actually had the opportunity to go there with Japanese colleagues about in I think it was 2014. It was very, very impressive. But the Dalai Lama was there right after the tsunami, and he says he sees, of course, there's a lot of emotion, even and especially for Japan, it's a really lot of emotion, and a lot of disaster and tragedy, and he sees this around the sobbing people around him. He says, "Please change your hearts, be brave," he said. "Please help everyone else and work hard. That's the best offering you can make to the dead." When he turned around, however, I saw him brush away a tear himself. And, I think it's just such a beautiful kind of, I don't know, it's something to emulate as a grief therapist, is to help people find their own way to do this, of course, because working hard, being brave, working hard, and helping other people is not, there's no prescription for that, right? It's something you have to find. It's really about accepting the loss and not getting preoccupied with why. I'm literally supervising someone right now in California, and this woman who lost her husband, very, very sad. I mean, they were extremely close, and it was a huge loss for her. But now it's like 2 years later, and she's still constantly saying, why? Why did this happen to me? Why? I mean, I listen to the tapes and I hear her say this, and she's kind of driving all of her friends away because they're like, they can't tolerate it anymore, and they're getting kind of harsh with her, or they're not calling her anymore, and it's just exactly what we see. So what this means is you're focusing on what's important in life, and you have to decide what's important in life. But you're focusing on what's important in life because you're still alive, and you let the person who died be gone. Not gone from your life, but gone from the physical world. So we don't focus on grief. Instead, we try to turn on a light, warm things up, and open a door to the outside world. That's kind of metaphorically what we're trying to do here. Again, the logical target, we think, is adapting, and even though grief is painful and it causes a lot of suffering, it's not the problem. So what adapting means we've already talked about, and so, you know, accepting the reality means, as I said, the finality and consequences, being able to envision a future with a sense of purpose and meaning and possibilities for happiness. And these are some of the kinds of things that we need to do and that we're going to be doing. So it means coping with the everyday stresses that death brings, essentially navigating a world of absence, a world defined by the Portuguese term saudade, which is actually used in a whole stream of beautiful music that evokes what they call the presence of absence. That's the best way you can translate it into English, apparently. And basically managing grief, one thing about managing grief and managing the emotions especially, so you have to accept, you have to understand what you're experiencing in some way. You have to comprehend what you're experiencing in that loss. You have to be able to manage in some way the intense emotions, which even after grief is integrated can spike up at times and do. Like the period of the year that's coming up soon, especially in the United States, where we have not only the holiday season, the Christian holidays in particular, but a lot of holidays, but also Thanksgiving for us. So starting very soon, starting around mid-November, people start to kind of feel pretty activated who have lost someone, even if they're not experiencing complicated grief. So, so this really, complicated grief is a persistent, or prolonged grief disorder is a persistent experience, not just at certain times of the year that we call difficult times. And then being able to connect in a meaningful way with memories. And that is, of course, often it's telling stories, it's looking at pictures, and it's often people have some kind of internal conversations with the person who died, or imagine, you know, they sort of think about them at times when they're trying to do something new or trying to do something different. That's all kind of part of it. And if you come to the workshop tomorrow, you'll hear a lot more about that. And then in the restoration-focused part of this, which is another way of saying the two things that you have to do are loss-focused and restoration-focused, the two ways you have to adapt. And this, by the way, I haven't said it, but I should have, comes from the very, very influential and important paper by Maggie Strobe and Hank Shute, published in 1999, around the time when we were beginning this work, in which is called the dual process model of coping. I'm assuming certainly most people in the audience are very, very familiar with that. So we follow that loss and restoration focus. One of the things they said is that you have to do them both in tandem, and that was a really important insight. You don't grieve the loss and then move on. You do them in tandem. And so these are but we think of restoration focus differently than they do. We think of restoration focused as finding an intrinsic motivation and finding a way to move forward in life in a meaningful way. And so this is really what we're going to be doing in this treatment, and I think I'm going to end at that point with just telling you a little bit about the Center for Complicated Grief, which is in my very last slides. See, I was very ambitious. Oh, actually what I'm going to do instead of that is this. I forgot I have those people that we just saw This is what they said after the treatment.
It finally dawned on me that just because I have family members who have died doesn't mean that he has forsaken me. And so now I can go to church and feel free and feel as though I have a relationship with him. And one of the ways I can establish the relationship and keep it going is to read the Bible, which is something that was real important to my mom. The therapist helped me do some reality testing to help me get past the guilt feelings, like I could have done something, I should have done something to prevent her death. And while I knew that intellectually, she helped me get to the emotional core of it. And we relived that experience, I guess, for maybe 3 weeks. And finally it dawned on, I really did all I could do. Well, that infected all areas of my life. I stopped being so reclusive. I got in touch with people from my past in New Jersey. I started making some plans professionally. I changed jobs. I did a lot of things that I never would have dreamed of doing before.
I can go back to reading, I can socialize again, I can meet new people, and I don't have to tell them that I have lost a child. I can deal with them as we go on. If they ask, I tell them that I still have 2 children. One just happens to have died.
I started taking yoga. So I made friends in the yoga class, we go for coffee, we go for bagels, we talk and talk. And it's wonderful. And I'm human again.
So thank you very much for your attention.